The art of the shaman, or as we call it, shamanism, is an ancient set of spiritual practices for healing and information and success of tribal units. And so, what would that have to do with today? How would that be relevant now? Why shamanism now? Why would anybody practice shamanism now, or go to a shamanic healer, or learn shamanism? How is it relevant today? So I'm going to answer all of those questions. My name is John Moore, and I am a teacher of shamanism from the state of Maine in the US. And I also practice shamanism, have clients in my healing practice, and I'm going to address this question. So, shamanism is really old. We don't know how old. There are lots and lots of theories. Some say 10,000 years or 15,000 years. Some people say it goes back to the dawn of humanity. Some people say 40,000 years. There's some difficulty around the definition of the word shamanism. So if we say the word shaman only refers to holy people in the Tungus region of Siberia, then no, shamanism isn't global or indeed probably that old. But if we look at shamanic practice, if we define shamanism as a set of tools, which includes altered states of consciousness, traveling in non-ordinary reality, and working with spirits, then that applies to a much broader range. And that is the definition that I use and that some academics use, going back to probably the 1960s, maybe even earlier than that. The challenge with figuring out when shamanism started and where it came from and all of those things is that it's prehistoric, right? We've only had writing for a few thousand years. We only have historic records for several thousand years. And other than that, we've got word of mouth stuff and rock art. Rock art tends to stay around a long time. We've got the pyramids, the hieroglyphs, but there's rock art, there's Mesoamerican rock art, there's rock art in Australia. In fact, there's a very old initiatory piece of rock art that many people argue as shamanic. And then there's a theory that these pieces of rock art, including ones that are 30,000 years old in Europe, depict shamanic states. And we'll let the academics debate that. It's neither here nor there. I'm going to use the word shamanism. I'm going to use the word shaman. And I have a whole video on the etymology of the word and how the idea that it was invented in Siberia by this one tribe in complete isolation from everybody else on the planet is false. It's just completely false and not supported by any sort of evidence. It's supported by assumption and nothing more. So, why shamanism now? So there are a few reasons why I think shamanism is still applicable. One is that it is deep in our core. The shaman is at this point an archetype, meaning it exists in the collective unconscious. I think there is this shamanic awakening that happens as a result of crisis, and that could be crisis of an individual, crisis of a culture, crisis of society, or crisis in the world. We're currently in the second year, maybe longer, of the global pandemic, and so that is a global crisis. And during this time, I have seen many people called to awaken shamanically. I will get into what that means at another time, but basically feeling the call to practice, the call to learn, the call to practice. Okay, this seems to be a natural result. The other thing that comes to mind is that, so beyond the archetypes, which have to do with consciousness and what's in the unconscious and what's in the collective, is the idea that we are hardwired for shamanic states. And this has been absolutely proven out by evidence. A very recent study shows that shamanic practitioners hook people up to EEG machines. Shamanic practitioners, when they are drumming, and that's a practice that I do. I use drumming to go into an altered state, are actually achieving a unique brain state. So there's a unique state of mind that human beings can achieve through shamanic drumming, through particular drumming rhythm that is repeated all over the world in different ways, sometimes through dance, sometimes through drumming, sometimes through other percussive instruments or wind instruments. But there's a rhythm that drives this particular state of mind that is unique, meaning there aren't any other ways to achieve this state of mind. We are hardwired for this. It bears, and this is important, it bears most closely to the brain state that people are in when they take magic mushrooms, otherwise known as psilocybin. Why is this important? Why do I want you to bear this connection with the use of psilocybin in mind? And there are shamanic cultures that use what we call plant medicine to enter into journey, and that includes psilocybin, peyote, ayahuasca, fly agark mushrooms, iboga in Africa, all kinds of substances. But we'll talk about psilocybin since that is what this study revealed, and it was a study of 500 practitioners. So it was a pretty across I believe just the U.S., but lots of different ways of practicing and lots of different schools that people came out of and that sort of thing. So it's a pretty broad study. Why is it important that this brain state is similar to psilocybin? Well, there's a lot of research that's going on right now with psychedelics, including psilocybin, in the use of in psychiatric use, right? So we've now started to open up psychiatric researchers, medical researchers, to use psychedelic substances, including ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, ayahuasca, and some others, to treat different types of medically diagnosed psychiatric disorders. I am not a medical practitioner. I am not a pharmacologist. I'm a lay person from that perspective. But I've done a lot of reading in this area because I think it's really interesting. And some of the early results show great promise in treating things like treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, things that are really kind of plaguing mankind from that perspective. So these chemicals seem to affect neuroplasticity quite a bit. I would argue, and research needs to be done, that entering shamanic state affects neuroplasticity quite a bit. I think that I would be an example of that because I came into shamanism myself to treat a PTSD diagnosis that had gone, the issue had existed for decades, and I am able to live symptom free, and I never took medication and didn't use psychedelics to get past that or anything like that. I used talk therapy and shamanic practice. So I believe that shamanic practice is a good adjunct to other types of therapies. I will not argue that shamanic practice replaces medicine, replaces talk therapy, replaces anything else. I think it's a good adjunct. I think it works well. In the model as I understand it, the model of how shamanic healing works is that it works on the spiritual aspect of healing, the spiritual underpinnings of disease, the fractured soul, all of these things. And the spirit, the mind, body, and spirit exist on kind of a continuum. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap between your mind and body. We know that trauma, for example, is stored in the body. You can look up polyvagal theory to find out more about that. You can look up the work of people like Bessel van der Kolk and others, Peter Levine and others, to see how the body hangs on to trauma. Okay, so there is overlap between mind and body there. And we know that people who have severe depressive disorder and have had it for a long period of time, when we draw their blood, you can find C-reactive proteins that are very similar to what people have when they're experiencing the flu. So there's an inflammatory response. And is the inflammatory response responsible for the depression, or is the depression responsible for the inflammatory response? I'm not sure, but there is a link there. And so on that continuum, those things overlap. There's also an overlap between spirit, between mind and spirit, and between body and spirit. There isn't a really clean definition. So when you look for healing and you work with the mind and you work with the body and you work with the spirit, you're firing on all cylinders. We are still biologically, the same people that we were 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, however old Homo sapiens existed. Some of us, I have quite a lot of Neanderthal DNA. You could probably tell by my forehead, my prominent forehead, that I have quite a lot of Neanderthal DNA. And so, we don't know if the brain structures of Neanderthals, but we do see them burying people. So, and by people, I mean other Neanderthals. We do see them doing burial rites and creating some art. So there is some level of symbolic thinking that can happen there, whether or not they could enter into, or other hominids could enter into trance states like we can. I don't know if we'll ever know that. Maybe we'll someday have the research to show that. But we haven't changed, and so this shamanic state, shamanic healing, I think is, and I would argue to my last breath, that it is a natural human birthright. By being born human, you have this ability, you have this healing ability. It is built into us for a reason. Whether you want to argue that it was divinity or God or the universe that created this ability in humans, or whether we evolved to have this ability to heal. Because 100,000 years ago, there weren't doctors and there weren't psychiatrists. And so what happened when people got sick or got traumatized? I realized that shamanism for many indigenous cultures goes well beyond healing. There were shamanic cultures where they're sort of specialists in sea navigation or reading the weather or determining when to plant things. But these were all things that were absolutely necessary for human survival. And so perhaps we evolved to have this shamanic state. Regardless of whether it was, we came out of, the first human being ever, the first Homo sapien ever to walk the planet, had this, and no other hominids did, or whether we evolved to have this state, we have it. And it is spiritual, mental, biological. It is unique to anything else that we do. It is different than listening to music, dancing, taking any kind of drug that we know, although it is similar to psilocybin, as I said. One of the differences between practicing shamanism and taking psilocybin is that I can stop practicing shamanism. I can come out of a journey anytime I want. Where with chemicals, they're in your body for as long as they're in your body. As far as I know, there's no antidote to psilocybin or ayahuasca or anything like that. So once you buy the ticket, you're on the ride. Sorry to say. So regardless, I think shamanism has a great deal of relevance today. And the number one complaint that my clients come to in my healing practice is a sense of disconnection from self, a sense of disconnection from the community, a sense of disconnection from nature, from the planet, from the world. It's described in different ways, but there's this feeling of not being connected. It's sort of a dissociated feeling. It can bring with it depression, anxiety, all kinds of health effects, that sort of thing. But it's the number one complaint currently that people bring to me. And yeah, we're in the middle of a global pandemic and people have been isolating and social distancing and wearing masks and all of these things. And so we've been really separated from one another. We've been really lacking that that connection, and it's sort of driven home how disconnected we as a society can become as well. So I clearly live in a house, or I live in a building anyway. It is a house, but there's a house around me, and while I may feel like I'm not a part of nature, I am, and I could just walk out my door to experience what we call nature, which I might call just being outdoors. Um, but I'm removed a little bit from the trees and the rocks and the wind and the rivers and the birds and the animals, and that's not our natural state. And so shamanism provides an opportunity and a method and a set of tools for reconnecting, for recognizing that we're connected to divinity, that we're connected to the universe, that we're connected to everything in the universe, and that includes ourselves, our deeper selves. It includes the people that we know and are in our environment, and in fact, all the people that are in the world, all of the animals and the trees and the rocks and the wind and the nature spirits. And it does help us recover that deep sense of connection that I think is a cornerstone of health, of mental health and physical health. There are experiments, there are horribly cruel experiments that you can read about from many years ago. I don't think they would let people do these experiments anymore, where they either, they would take a baby monkey away from its mother and just raise it in isolation, and it would fail to thrive, and in fact probably not live very long and be very underweight and all of these things, because that connection is important, and that is, that's a monkey. It's even more important for us as a species, as human beings. We have parts of our brain that are hardwired for social connection. There's a part of our brain called the anterior cingulate cortex that processes social connection, social cues, and where we are in the social hierarchy. And it's also a location that's associated with the processing of pain. So social rejection we might see as being painful, right? When somebody rejects us, it's painful. Why is that? Why do we experience that not as physical pain, but as in our brain, as so difficult, as so hard, as a form of suffering? So we need to restore that sense of connection to be healthy. They've done similar things with children, I believe. Hopefully nobody's doing anything like that anymore. But it's the same kind of thing. Children raised outside of good solid social connections and not having secure we call secure attachments in early life, they don't develop the same way or as easily, or they have problems, they have psychological or developmental problems later on in life. So shamanism can help restore this sense of connection. So there's the healing aspect, right? Some people want to bolster their physical healing by building up their energy system, or attending to their soul body, to create the conditions under which the body can heal itself. There's the psychological aspect, which I get a significant amount of clients coming to me with needs that are psychological, and that doesn't mean that somebody necessarily has a diagnosed psychological condition, which is the medical model of psychology. You could have trauma and have some experiences of that, but not qualify to be diagnosed with PTSD. And that's something that shamanism is really good with, is helping people with trauma. And there is the psycho-spiritual aspect of helping restore people to a sense of wholeness and a sense of connection. And this is where I think returning to our roots, there's this whole movement called rewilding, which is about going out and becoming closer to nature, recovering quote unquote primitive skills or primitive technology. And I don't use I use primitive because other people use that terminology, but I mean older technologies. Now these things didn't require any less ingenuity, skill, or intelligence. We're not more intelligent than our forefathers. We may be less intelligent than our forefathers, but we have different technology, right? So primitive skills like fire building, shelter building, foraging, there are whole movements around this. On my podcast, I had a friend not too long ago who is a mindful wilderness guide, and that is part of the healing experience, to go out into the wilderness, experience nature in full mindfulness, and experience your connection with nature. So if somebody were to ask me why shamanism is important now, I would give them all of those reasons. That it is A, part of our human inheritance, that is B, an effective tool in our toolbox of things that heal us, and B, there is an awakening that seems to happen as a result of crisis. So it's a natural thing for us to reach out for, to look for, and that it can restore our sense of connection, which is sadly lacking. We can definitely see disconnection in this world. I hope this has been informative. Please subscribe to this channel. I appreciate you, and I will talk to you real soon.